Today's lecture, I'm going to, like I said, talk about the 1800s. I'm going to kind of go back to kind of like the post-Napoleon era of Europe, like right after, you got the French Revolution that occurs, and then you got the age of Napoleon. Napoleon seized power. He's in power in like France and part of Europe up to 1814, 1815. And of course, he's exiled. I'll kind of go through some of the things that kind of happened in Europe afterwards. Primarily, I'll kind of talk about France and Russia because those two states really do a lot of things with their states afterwards, their empires. So we'll kind of get into that a little today. So if you have any comments, questions about this lecture, or I guess during the live stream, if you're later here, you can leave, of course, a question or comment later. Also, you can also subscribe to my channel if you want to keep up with future videos and all that. So anyway, like I said, I had a previously recorded lecture that we talked about before, which was on the French Revolution and Age of Napoleon. So I should have already watched that last week. Of course, I talked about how the French Revolution occurred, where France basically overthrew the Bourbon regime, Louis XVI. And then, of course, they went through a lot of radical changes in the country. And then, of course, by 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was this Italian guy from Corsica, eventually took over the country and became the general. And then later Emperor of France, of course, in 1804, Age of Napoleon, which spawned, of course, a bunch of these so-called Napoleonic Wars, which lasted until 1814, 1815. And then, of course, he's sent into exile. Now, after he got exiled, of course, they put in the Bourbon dynasty was put back into France, which I think the Congress of Vienna was kind of behind that. A lot of the French and I think the Russians were kind of behind restoring that monarchy back to power. So the Bourbon restoration took place in 1814 and in 1815 because Napoleon, remember, came back out of the Battle of Waterloo and all that occurred. And so they were restored at that point. And so the monarch they put back in power was Louis XVIII. He came into power in 1814, would reign around 10 years until 1824. You can see the Bourbons were restored really up to 1830 that they were in power. So another 16 years that they'd be, of course, there overall. And at this point, what happened was France became a constitutional monarchy, which they had this new constitution they created, which was called the Charter of 1814, which I think after Napoleon exiled, Louis XVIII actually had to flee. When Napoleon returned in 1814, they brought it back in 1815. And what this constitutional charter did in 1814, it created a constitutional monarchy where France had this new assembly that they created, which was called the Chambers. It had a bicameral legislature, which was kind of influenced by the British model, like their parliament, House of Commons, House of Lords. Now, these two chambers, they had the Chamber of Deputies, which was more for like the middle class or the common people. And then the Chamber of Peers was more for like the nobility, which nobility kind of came back into France. The Chamber of Peers was kind of like almost like the House of Lords, like in Britain. It also included a Bill of Rights, which guaranteed basic rights for all Frenchmen, which included like freedom of religion, freedom of expression, basic property rights, freedom of press. And they had some forms of also male suffrage was also brought in where men could vote, but it was kind of limited by a poll tax where you had to pay a tax to vote. By the way, I've got an image there. He is Louis XVIII right there. He had a lot of powers. Like if you compare him to, say, the British monarchs back in the early, 19th century or whatever, he had quite a lot of power compared to other kind of rulers. And it was almost in a sense that they were trying to restore the ancient regime that they had before, going back to, say, Louis XVI or the Bourbons. And under this regime of his, he could establish treaties as a monarch. He could declare war. He could command the forces, like the armed forces of France, like the Navy, the armies. He could appoint judges. He could appoint ministers. And he could even issue ordinances and draft laws, which is pretty amazing for a monarch, because most really heads of state can't do that. But he could under this actual constitution that was actually put in. Now, the only thing about him was that he didn't have any children. And so the throne then went to his younger brother, who was the Count d'Artois. You see in that image right there, he would go on to reign from 1824 to 1830. Charles X, as they called him, was the last Bourbon monarch they had. Bob Bourbon King, no more Bourbons after that in France. And the only thing about Charles X was that he was an ultra royalist. He really believed that the monarchs of France ought to be absolutists. And so under his regime, he would try to take away rights from a lot of the lower class, middle class, lower classes throughout the country. And so he was kind of considered more radical. He was a radical monarchist, and he didn't really like the Charter of 1814. In fact, he made a comment once that I would rather be a woodcutter than be the King of England. They saw the King of England as being kind of weak and kind of a limited monarch, etc. And so he was kind of opposed, you can see there, to giving concessions to more liberal groups, radical groups to him, and actually wanted to try to squash some of their liberties within the actual Constitution of France, the Charter of 1814. Now get to the famous, there's going to be a revolution that'll overthrow him in July of 1830. I'll come back in a second. Some other things he was known for, I did want to talk about first. Yeah, he was the actual ruler, they think, that started the initiation of the French conquest of Algeria, which happened between 1830 to 1903. It took the French about 70-something years to take over Algeria, which is in North Africa. And it was kind of used as a way to distract people from domestic problems that the country was having at the time in the 19th century. And so this is kind of the beginning of the French getting into North Africa, which the French will have a bunch of colonies that'll be there in that area. The bad thing about the conquest of Algeria, it was controversial. The reason why is because the French committed a lot of genocide, they believe, when they conquered Algeria, forced them to be part of their empire. And the Algerians responded with like a guerrilla campaign, and that's why it took the French over 7 decades to basically take control of it. And Algeria used to be part of the French Empire, but years ago they voted to leave it. You know about that. Oh, the other thing he's famous for, which I guess we'll kind of mention it. We'll mention about it later, but the big thing that's going to happen to, of course, him, which is famous about, of course, Charles X. He gets overthrown, and part of the reason for that was because of the fact that in 1830, after around July, Charles X issued these ordinances. They're called the July Ordinances, and what they did was they eliminated the press in France. They also dissolved the Chamber of Deputies, that main chamber that was for like the common people, middle class especially. He tried to exclude the middle class from even voting, where only the upper class could vote. And so this made the people very angry. And so it led to a revolution, which was later dubbed the July Revolution of 1830. They sometimes call it the so-called 3 Glorious Days. And so Charles X was forced into exile. And that pretty much, practically ended the whole Bourbon dynasty at one point. There are paintings made of it later, like the one of Eugene Delacroix was made in 1830, which is called Liberty Leading the People. It's kind of depicted a lot of the images of all these different people that were involved, not just men and women, but You can see even kids gotten involved to overthrow his regime, which I think took place over like 3 days in late July of 1830. So that's basically what happened, with that him getting overthrown. What happened next? He was then replaced by this other monarch who came in, who was known as Louis Philippe. So let's call it Louis Philippe the First, and the wrong one I want to put on there, but he would be put in, and he was known by different nicknames. He was called the King of the French People. Was kind of the nickname that he was called. He has all kinds of names. They called him like the Citizen King, I think was another name they called him. And he was also known as the July Monarch. And he became famous in 1840 for bringing back the remains of Napoleon Bonaparte, who died on St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, had him buried in this famous complex of buildings in Paris called Les Invalides, which is a kind of a collection of museums and monuments that honor like France's heroes in the history of France. And it's, of course, known for having a lot of famous people that are buried there today. Think about the image showing Napoleon Bonaparte's his crypt there where he's buried in Les Invalides, and was supposed to kind of, I think, help Louis Philippe become more popular, but it actually made the Bonapartists, the relatives of Napoleon, more popular than he did. So that was the only bad downside of that, of course, which is later. He probably was one of the longest reigning, like Louis Philippe, compared to some of his other rulers, lasted the longest, like almost 18 years. I think it was 17 and a half years, actually. But what happened was by 1847, France's economy crashed. They had a lot of economic problems in Europe, which was caused by different reasons. I think had financial panics, I know that, bad harvests and other issues that really caused hard times. And of course, you had the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of the workers felt like they weren't getting enough rights, enough power, enough higher wages, kind of like inflation right now, the way it is. And so they had this revolution break out called the February Revolution of 1848, which lasted, again, 3 days. And think of that image showing the revolution right here. And it was part of what was caused by these events in Europe that were nicknamed the revolutions of 1848, where a lot of the working class, middle classes revolted against the upper classes and the governments in Europe. Happened in France and Germany, happened in Austria, Hungary, Poland, all kinds of countries. I think Italy had also workers that kind of did the same thing as well. And a lot of people were rejecting the conservatism of the age of Metternich that had kind of been spawned by the Congress of Vienna back in 1814, 1815, after Napoleon had been exiled. Remember Clemens von Metternich, that famous minister of Austria, and he had tried to prevent the spread of liberal or radical ideas throughout Europe. A lot of that came crashing down after 1848. A lot of countries are going to have to start kind of creating more reforms. Constitutional monarchies and even Republican kind of forms of government become more popular more than anything. So in France, what happened was they then went to a new government was brought into power at that point. There's going to be some different monarchs that come in that'll take over. They'll, of course, have the so-called Second French Empire that'll eventually develop by 1852. At first, the French tried to adopt a republic. In 1848, 1852, they adopted a new constitution. France, by the way, has gone through a lot of constitutions, as many as 20, believe it or not, going back to the French Revolution. This was the Second Republic. The First Republic had been like during the French Revolution, back in the late 18th century. And under this republic, they created a unicameral legislature, which was called the National Assembly, which was, its name went back to the French Revolution, if you remember. And the big thing they did, of course, in 1848, was they elected the first president of France, which, the president of France is the main head of state that they have today. It was done through universal suffrage, where all men could vote in the country. And the president was elected for a 4-year term, which I think initially at that time, he could only serve one term overall. Well, they elect, by the way, a man which later will be known by the name Emperor Napoleon III. His real name was originally Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He was actually a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte through one of his brothers, which was Louis Bonaparte. And he had been in exile for years. And finally, I think in the 1840s, he returned to France. And he was elected in December of 1848. Anyway, he served for roughly, I think, 3 or 4 years of his term, but he got kind of frustrated about the fact that he can only serve like one 4-year term. And so what happened was in December of 1851, which happened to be, by the way, the anniversary of when his uncle Napoleon I, or Napoleon Bonaparte, had been crowned as emperor, December 2nd, I think it was 04. He basically formed this coup d'etat to overthrow the French government, and he put himself in basically as a dictator. And then what happened was he declared himself an emperor after that. And so that will start a new period afterwards, which is known as the Second French Empire, which will go from 1852 to 1870. And he's known as Emperor Napoleon III, of course, as you can see. He has other nicknames too. I think they sometimes would call him Napoleon the Short. He was kind of short. He was actually, they had an election. 97% of the voters voted to make him hereditary emperor. So they did have an election, basically like they did his uncle. They elected him emperor also as well. And the state he would create, by the way, was very conservative. It was the Second French Empire was a conservative authoritarian state. And I'll get into that. There's people they didn't like, they got rid of you. They sent you to like South America or something like that. But he did help to modernize the French state. That's something he does. Like Paris is, modernized, and the model of Paris, the modernization of it, especially in the late 19th century, is copied by a lot of other cities throughout the world overall. I have a map showing you, like, at one point, their empires that they had, the French. I know in the mid to late 19th century, the French Empire peaked at almost about 4.5 million square miles. To kind of give you an idea, they get in the 19th century, they get a lot into Africa, West Africa. You can see Algeria, Morocco, and all those areas you can see there. The area that's into the west, you see in North America, they lose that later. So that was that they lost that already. I think going back to, I want to say the time of I think that was lost during the 7 Years' War, of course. Haiti, they lose that, I think, under Napoleon. India, they lost that though under like after the 7 Years' War, and then Indochina is something that they'll add later. They'll have late 19th. I think they start getting into there a little bit, and then into the 20th century as well. Madagascar, too, is another area you can see that they also were into as well. So, yeah, this empire will stretch over different parts of the world. You can see in that map. Also, of course, the thing I usually talk about that's kind of famous that he did, Napoleon III, he helped to, like I said, modernize Paris. There was this man named Baron George Eugene Haussmann that helped to modernize basically the capital of Paris, which was a huge, massive urban renewal program where they added new, buildings, new boulevards, parks, and public works, which was done like over like a period of like something like 2 decades that they did this almost. It was kind of controversial at the time because they went and destroyed a lot of old buildings that went back to several centuries that had been there before. You can see they put the Arc de Triomphe kind of in the middle, right there. And so, so-called City of Lights, it's which is what they nicknamed they call it Paris sometimes. Its modernization will influence other cities, throughout the world. A lot of people kind of copy that kind of design. It is an interesting city because Paris is one of those cities that wasn't really destroyed like during World War II, and so it's a very unique city to visit, of course, in Europe. These are kind of some of the cities like throughout the world that copied Paris, like on the modernization thing. Cairo, which is in Egypt, Buenos Aires in South America, Brussels, of course, in Europe, Rome in Italy, Vienna, of course, Austria, Stockholm in Scandinavia, Madrid in Spain, Barcelona in Spain, Berlin even kind of modeled itself a little bit, of course, after Paris also as well. The other thing he did too, which is really famous that I wanted to mention about, Napoleon III did help to get the Suez Canal built, which that was built later in the late 1800s, and it was built by this company that was called the Suez Canal Company. It was completed in 1869, and I think the French and the British were kind of involved in getting it constructed. There was a famous man named Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was a Frenchman, who was really the creator and developer of the Suez Canal. They used a lot of Arabs mostly to construct and build it. And I think I've got images showing the canal itself right here, but you can see they used up to thousands of workers, which about 120,000 may have died in the construction of it. Traffic of the Suez Canal opened in November of 1869. You can see it connected basically the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. Like 120 miles is the length of the Suez Canal. And it shortened the route to go from, say, Europe to Asia or Asia to Europe. You can see on the right there, if you want to go to, say, from Britain to, say, India, it used to take close to 12,000 miles to sail around Africa. And you can see there that it now is 7,200. So it cut out like 5,000 miles, to go that way. So kind of a shortcut. Later on, they'll build another canal, which is the Panama Canal, which will shorten the length, to go from the Atlantic side to the Pacific Ocean instead of going around South America. So that's something Teddy Roosevelt was behind, of course, in the United States later. Here's, of course, image, of course, of the Suez Canal, which is right there. There's something else he was known for also, Napoleon III. He was notorious for starting this French Guiana penal colony that was built in the northern part of South America. Its capital there you see is Cayenne. And anybody they saw as like a kind of a reject of French society or criminals or whatever, they basically sent you there to exile, to get rid of you to this prison colony that was there pretty much. And got images of course, Devil's Island, which is, of course, well known today because they've made a lot of movies about it. And it has like several islands that were part of it that was there. It included like a prison system on the actual mainland. And they had like about 3 of these islands that were off the coast of Guyana, which included 3 islands you can see, St. Joseph, Royal Island, and they had one that was called Devil's Island. You see at the top there. That's the one that was the most notorious of the 3. It was open for like around 100 years. So 1852 is when they first operated it. And it closed in 1953. By the way, the prison system had one of the worst death rates in the world. Of all the prisoners that went there, 75% of them died in actual the prisons there. And even if you served your prison term, like the full length or whatever, they wouldn't let you go back to France. You had to stay in the colony in South America, and the conditions were horrible. Malaria, mosquitoes, and all that, swampy type, climate. And so a lot of people died there from disease also as well. They made movies about it. I think there's been a couple movies I know have been made. The most famous is Papillon, of course, was Steve McQueen, where it kind of discusses how notorious this particular prison was. Another thing that Napoleon III was real famous for in the 1860s, he got France involved in this intervention in Mexico. It's called different things. They had two of these, I know, at one point, but the one he got them involved in was the Second French Intervention in Mexico, which went on from 1861 to 1867. And he backed one of his relatives, who was a cousin of his named Maximilian, and he put him on the throne of Mexico. Later became known as the Second Mexican Empire. And the reason why they did this was because of the fact that the Mexicans weren't paying their foreign debts that they owed. And so the French went in there to try to occupy the state, force them to pay their debts. And while they're at it, they tried to take over the country also as well. And so they formed this empire, which lasted about 6 years. Yeah, it was about, it was 1861 to 67. It happened like around when the American Civil War was going on, because some of the Confederates even tried to get help from this particular empire that was in Mexico, like military aid, etc. And anyway, what happened was the Mexicans put up a fight. They basically used like guerrilla warfare against the French. They actually were successful in some battles. I think the most famous battle you may have heard of that was associated with the French intervention in Mexico was the Battle of Puebla, which took place May 5th, 1862. That's, of course, famous now as Cinco de Mayo, the celebrations they have, every year, celebrating, I guess, one of the first victories that the Mexicans had against the French. But it took them several years to oust the French. They eventually captured Maximilian, and they shot him. They killed him. And so eventually it failed, that attempt to take over Mexico. I'll talk about it later, but Napoleon also gets France involved in the Crimean War, where France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire fight Russia for control of the Crimean Peninsula, the northern Black Sea. That's something he was kind of also known for as well. Now, I want to move on next. I want to talk about the Russian Empire a little bit today. Of course, I was kind of getting to that main topic, of course, of talking about the Crimea. It's kind of a hot area, of course, in part of Eastern Europe. Now, the Russian Empire was vast. The Russian Empire, the size of it was about, I think, 8.8 million square miles, which peaked in the 19th century. Look at this, of course, slide right here. Russia itself was kind of still somewhat backwards a little bit compared to the Western powers. I know Peter the Great, Catherine the Great helped to kind of modernize the state at that point. They were kind of behind everybody else. More oppression, especially the lower classes. Censorship was pretty big. They were very anti-liberal. They were pretty much conservative, the Russians. But you'll see later, because of events like the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians don't fare in a lot of foreign wars, and it helps to kind of weaken them internally and also internationally as well. Now, Russia in the 19th century, they had a lot of different rulers, of course, that were in power, you can see. Following the Napoleonic Wars, Russia became staunch conservative, especially because of like Napoleon. Napoleon had invaded Russia, and Napoleon had all these, liberal ideas that they tried to push throughout Europe. And so a lot of the Russians were kind of against that. They didn't want to make all these reforms. They were worried about the serfs rebelling in the country. And so, under this ruler named Alexander I, he became a staunch conservative, reigning from 1801 to 1825. Here he is. And Alexander was a grandson of Catherine the Great. I believe he was the son of Emperor Paul I. And originally he was reform minded, believe it or not. He had some reforms, I think, before that, but because of Napoleon, like I said, invading Russia, he became this reactionary and conservative. And he had formed alliances in Europe against Napoleon, of course, several coalitions, which helped defeat him over time. So he'll be in power, like I said, until 1825. And under him, he would try to get rid of people that were considered a threat to his empire. I think by the time of his reign, they formed this Russian secret police that was called the Okhrana. The Okhrana would try to uproot any enemies of the state that might be a threat to Russia. And people that were a threat, they would exile them. They would get rid of them, and a lot of them were sent to Siberia in the eastern part of Russia. So they started doing this around the 18th, 19th centuries. Now, the only thing was they had a problem that occurred when in 1825, Alexander died. He didn't have any children, and so the throne was up to two of his brothers to take the throne, which were Constantine Pavlovich, and then he had a younger brother named Nicholas that he had. So he had these two rulers that they had that were basically could have gotten the throne at that point. Here's, of course, Constantine Pavlovich right here. He was actually the governor of Poland at the time. And he decided he'd want the throne. He liked being the governor of Poland. I think his wife was Polish, although the Polish didn't really like him. But he didn't really want to be the czar and emperor. And so in 1825, he abdicated. And he gave the throne, by the way, to this ruler right here on the right, which is his younger brother, Nicholas. So he'll be Emperor Nicholas I. And what happened was apparently some of the people didn't like this, the fact that he had abdicated, and it created this incident called the Decembrist Revolt, because apparently some of the people in the Russian military wanted Constantine to become the ruler and not Nicholas. I think they say Constantine was more liberal, I think, and some of them wanted some reforms, whereas Nicholas was more conservative. And so it spawned this revolt after that. And Nicholas, basically, when he takes power, there's actually a deal where about 3,000 army officers revolted against him. They basically create this standoff between him and Nicholas, saying, we want Constantine, to become the emperor. And so they end up becoming known as the so-called Decembrists, as their nickname, because it happened December of 1825. And the actual standoff itself took place, it's called different names, but they sometimes call it Senate Square or Peter Square in the capital of St. Petersburg. And Nicholas, to break it up, actually brought in cannon and basically shot it at them and basically dispersed them. And then a bunch of them were arrested, those that weren't killed. And many of them were eventually put on trial. Of course, a lot of them were found guilty, if you know about that. Some were executed, and then the Russians, as I told you before, sent a lot of them into exile, including, by the way, their wives or their fiancés. They're like engaged or whatever, and a lot of them went with them. Believe it or not, I think they were called Decembrist wives or something like that. And so Nicholas decided that he was going to be like his, older brother, Alexander. He was going to be, a staunch conservative, pretty much. Nicholas did do some things to try to change the country, which is true. One of the things he did do, he tried to modernize the state, something he did, because Russia was trying to expand its economy and also expand, colonize eastward into Siberia. And so they began to industrialize the state. They began building some railroads throughout the country and so on. I think I've got an example of something they did do that's kind of famous in Russia under Nicholas. they actually built this highway system that was called the Great Siberian Route. That was constructed in the 1800s, and it was this road system that connected like Western Russia, where Moscow is, all the way to like the far east, like in parts of Siberia. You can see close where Lake Baikal is on that eastern side of Russia. And it was sometimes called the T route. It was called this because some of the part of the route went down into Mongolia and then into China. And so they could get things like tea and spices and other things, silk from China, etc. And so that became the basis of what later will be the Trans-Siberian Railway, will be kind of built along that route. It's now like a great highway system running across Russia from west to east today. Now, of course, the big thing that happened at the end of his reign was they had the Crimean War broke out. Started in 1853, and it'll last till 1856. And you'll see even other countries will get involved. It'll originally be a conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, which both those countries started to fight over, like the Crimea and also the area, I think, close to where Romania is today. And the British and the French then came in and allied with the Turks against the Russians. And so this became one of the most famous wars, I think, in Europe in the 19th century. I think outside of, I want to say, outside of the Napoleonic Wars, which happened like at the earlier part of the 19th century. There were different causes of the Crimean War. One of the main causes, of course, was over conflicts over the Black Sea, the northern coast, especially. The Russians and the Turks, they go back years. And Russia had this dream, by the way, of one day controlling Constantinople again. I think going back to, I want to say, the early 19th century, there had been talk of maybe trying to retake it. But the Turks, had named it Istanbul today. And so I think around under the reign of Nicholas, they were trying to take control of the Balkans area, which is like around Romania. And then they already had the Crimea as well at that time. And Nicholas, by the way, go back up to him. Nicholas kind of saw at that time that the Ottoman Empire was declining. He once said that the Ottomans or the Turks were like the sick man of Europe. The fact that this empire was like sick and old and dying in a bed, and he realized that he thought that he could be able to take control of part of their empire, maybe even take Istanbul or Constantinople, take it back, and things like that. And so, anyway, the what happened to cause the war to really expand and get like other powers involved, like the British and the French. The British and the French were kind of concerned that the Russian bear, Russian Empire, would threaten a lot of trade, not just the Black Sea, but in the Far East, because the British, French are getting into parts of Asia. You got the British in China, the French are in Indochina, things like that, and so there are really concerns that they may threaten that area of the world. So that's definitely a major cause, one cause that really got those powers involved in it. There was also a question of religion. Apparently, there was a conflict that broke out between the French and the Russians over who should control the Christian churches in the Holy Land that are there. Like in now, I guess it was Israel or Palestine. And the Turks basically said that the French, who were Catholic, the Catholics ought to get it. And they were really angry about that, the Russians, who, of course, were Orthodox. So that was definitely another issue that they think helped to kind of cause war between both sides. The Crimean War is famous for different things. You can see it was fought 1853-56. But the big thing it's known for, it is known as one of the first modernized wars. Kind of up there with like maybe the American Civil War, et cetera. But you start to see the use of railroads being used to ship, war materials and men off to conflict. The use of telegraphs. It was the first conflict where they used telegraphs for telecommunications. So they kind of knew what was kind of going on at the front lines, who was killed or wounded, that kind of thing. You can see in that image too there that it was one of the first wars where they photographed the soldiers or the battlefield. So they got men right there, look like, I think those are British soldiers. And so that's something you start to see. American Civil War is like that too, where you start to see, pictures of the battlefield, of the soldiers, and even some of the dead. There's something you see on the battlefield, images of it also as well. Other things about the war, which is kind of famous, I've got a list of them here, but yeah, it was one of the first wars where mass-produced rifles start to come in, where they fight with a lot of these kind of rifles. Exploding artillery shells were also used as well. Sea mines were used. Armored ships, they go from wooden to armored ships pretty much by the mid-19th. You see that in the American Civil War too, like ironclads or whatever. Long-range cannons. So use of steel, starts to kind of come in because they start mass producing it very cheaply. Of course, there's something that you may have heard about the war. Where's the image? I want to get to right here. But yeah, the modern nursing is something else too that's very famous about the Crimean War as well, which they say Florence Nightingale, who's a famous, British nurse, was the one that helped to start modern nursing overall. They often called her the lady with the lamp, and she helped to set up hospitals during the war, which aided, soldiers that had been wounded on the battlefield. So that's something she was kind of known for. There she is, a kind of a photograph of Florence Nightingale. Now, I think later she set up, I think in Britain, one of the first nursing schools to teach like nursing and things like that today. All right, other things, of course, I want to talk about. If you go back up here, not to that map, but this one right here, the Crimean War, you can see mostly was fought. They fought around the Balkans, things like that, like especially where close to Romania is and all that. But primarily where they fought the most was on the Crimean Peninsula, which you see is on the right there. And in 1854, the coalition forces using naval power brought armies up to basically take the Crimean Peninsula, which the Crimean Peninsula, by the way, is very important because that's where the Russians had their Black Sea Fleet, which they still have today. As the biggest city there is the city of Sevastopol, which is a port city that's on the southern part of it right there. I got an image, I thought, of Sevastopol right here. But you see they came up through that, through the Mediterranean Sea and into the Black Sea right there. And anyway, the siege itself would last close to a year. Like you can see September 1854 and end close to about September 1855. And the French and the British had like an overwhelming force, but it just took them months and months to basically defeat the Russians, who had better defenses for them. They couldn't take it because they had better defenses basically around where Sevastopol is. The most famous battle they talk about sometimes is the Battle of Balaclava, which happened in October of 1854. Of course, it's a famous battle associated with the Crimean Peninsula, but it's also known as being immortalized in a poem, which was, of course, written by Alfred Lord Tennyson, the so-called The Charge of the Light Brigade. And, of course, they've also made paintings of it before, which you may have seen before. Think about images showing, I think that's one of them right here, painting that was done years ago. And the Charge of the Light Brigade was like a light brigade unit, cavalry unit of the British, which I think had 700 troops in it. And I want to say about 40% of the men were killed or wounded. A lot of them didn't make it back. And so it got immortalized. But I think the battle was actually indecisive. Like neither side won the battle. And that's kind of the way the siege was. Like neither side really won the actual siege. But the Russians eventually had to withdraw because basically neither side could really win. But in the end, they would withdraw, and the treaty that would end the war would be basically the Treaty of Paris, 1856. The Russians were kind of humiliated about the Crimean conflict. Um, they had to scuttle their fleet because they didn't really want the Black Sea Fleet to get captured by the coalition side. And so they were told for like 20 years that they couldn't occupy the Crimea or have naval forces on the Black Sea. And so that's basically the agreement that was kind of made between both sides after the war. But really, both sides were kind of, it was almost like a draw in a sense, because I think both sides were kind of like the whole campaigns didn't really go well like they thought they would, overall. But in the end, they do think that the Russians would kind of it would kind of mark a turning point in the history of Russia. A lot of people kind of see sometimes this conflict as like maybe a turning point, which leads to their decline of their empire, which kind of will go more into the late 1800s and the 19th century. But Russia, was supposed to be this major power that could obviously affect Europe, and it didn't really do anything much after that. So it's going to allow, the rise of Germany. German Empire is going to eventually emerge after this, because Russia is kind of weakened, they think, a little bit after this particular conflict. Now, what's going to happen? But they say because of what occurred with the Crimean Wars, that the Russians are going to try to make reforms to the country. So that's going to happen under a czar. You see at the top right, which is Alexander II. He's going to come in. He's going to start making a bunch of reforms to the country to try to modernize the state even more. Of course, I'll get to it. The big thing he's going to do, which is real famous, he's going to abolish the peasant serfdom, which is big in Russia still at that time in the 19th century. Yeah, they did do some reforms under Alexander II. They did relax at one point censorship, because I told you, I think going back to Alexander I, there was a lot of censorship in the country. They kept modernizing the country with railroads also as well. Military was modernized some more. He did reform the Orthodox Church. They modernized banks. Mining and manufacturing industries were kind of starting to modernize also in Russia. But I think Russia was still kind of backwards compared to France, Germany, Britain, more to the western part of Europe more than anything. Alexander got a famous nickname, of course. He became known as the so-called Tsar Liberator, or Alexander the Liberator, they called him, because 1861, he eventually abolished serfdom in the country. And so millions of serfs, throughout the country they got their freedom. They got actual full rights, as citizens of Russia. They weren't bound to the land like they were before, going back to, I guess, Peter the Great or whatever. And so these are some of the things that they could do. After that, they got, like I said, full rights as citizens. They could actually marry without having to get consent from their landowner. That was the only thing about that. Wanted to get married, you had to get consent for it. They could own property. They could own a business. So these are all things that basically they were given overall under Alexander II. You can see they freed something like 25 million serfs throughout the country. So that was something he was very famous for. And I think sometimes in the United States, I know they sometimes compare him to Abraham Lincoln. They call him the Russian Lincoln, because Lincoln freed the slaves, of course, in the United States, so he freed the serfs. There were some reforms he did that's famous. Alexander II, he had these reforms. They call it usually the Mir, I think was what they called it, or Obscena, I think was another nickname they called it. And these were land reforms where they created these village communities, like a commune is what it really was, where peasants could hold communal farmlands together and have land. And it's something that he was known for doing. That was famous. And it's kind of like you see something later in Europe. It's not quite like the farming collectives that the Bolsheviks have, later, the communists. but it's kind of halfway there. But they didn't really have capitalist farming. I think they tried to experiment with it later. You may have heard of the Stolypin reforms, where they tried to make some kind of reforms to create capitalist type farming. But later on, the Soviet Union tries to do collectivization, and it's just total disaster. Um, one more thing he's famous for, Alexander II. Alexander II was the one that sold Alaska to the United States. The Russians decided that they wanted to get out of Alaska. Very few people lived there. Mostly it was just used for like fur trade. And so in 1867, he sold it to Andrew Johnson's administration for $7.2 million. Of course, we thought Johnson was crazy to buy it, by the way. We called it Seward's Folly because it was named after William Seward, who was the Secretary of State at the time. But later on, when they discovered like gold, oil, Alaska, we realized that Alaska was kind of more important than what we thought it was. So yeah, Russia's starting to shrink, as pretty much as a country at that point. But you can see the size of Russia was pretty vast. Like I said, 8.8 million square miles. Russia is still the largest state in the world. I think I was reading somewhere where there's so many people per square miles. Like I think it was at 20-some people per so many square miles. It's just like parts of it are very isolated throughout Russia. And I think only like 20% of the actual people in Russia live in like Siberia, as an actual example. Going back up to this slide right here, now the ruler on the bottom right, that's Alexander III. He was the emperor of Russia from 1881 to 94. He came to power because his father, Alexander II, who was supposed to be this reformer, got assassinated. There was this kind of a radical terrorist group that called themselves the People's Will. They assassinated him in St. Petersburg, where they blew him up with a bomb. I think it blew his leg off and he bled to death. And so his son basically took over. And his son was kind of a reactionary. He was kind of like, he wanted to try to maybe slow down some of these reforms that, Alexander II, his father, was trying to do. And so he reversed a lot of the reforms. He also was a very, very staunch Orthodox Christian. And so he tried to push religion throughout the country, Christianity, and he hated the Jews. He was very anti-Semitic, and a lot of his policies eventually led to these anti-Jewish riots throughout the country, which were called pogroms. And a lot of Jews fled the country because a lot of them fled to like Germany and other countries in Europe, and even some, I think, fled to America, of course, later. So he was kind of a staunch conservative compared to like his father. He was more reform-minded. One of the most famous things that Alexander III started in Russia, he's the one that began constructing the Trans-Siberian Railway network, which ran from basically Moscow in the western part of Russia to Siberia in the Far East. It was started in 1891 and it was completed in 1916 during World War I. It was actually finished by his son, Nicholas II. And this actual railway system, by the way, is one of the longest in the world that will be eventually built. And I think it's like 6,000 miles long or more, the actual railway system. But I think if you add in the other legs, because it later goes down into like Mongolia, actually not, it goes down to China, North Korea, links up those areas right there. I want to say with all those, I think it's like 10,000 miles, maybe. So it is one of the longest railway networks, of course, in the world. It was kind of important later because it did help to create more migration to Siberia, because they think that basically, I think before World War I, around 10 million people had actually helped populate it in eastern Russia. But like I said, only about 20% of the Russian population actually lives in the eastern part, like in Siberia today. So yeah, kind of talking about some of the things that he was known for. They have one more czar. We won't get as much into him today, but the last czar of Russia is Nicholas II. He reigned 1894 to 1970. He kind of reigns during a time when Russia is definitely starting to decline as a major power. They're not as powerful as other countries in the world, like the British, especially, or even Germany. Germany's starting to become more of a major power throughout the world. And it was caused by different things. I know one was caused by defeats. Like there was an issue where the Russian Navy was severely beaten by the Japanese Navy, the Far East, because the two powers were kind of fighting to control part of like Siberia and also especially Korea, because the Japanese would take over Korea right after that. And then Russia experienced a bunch of revolutions. Like under Nicholas II, they had the Revolution of 1905, which that one it forced him to create kind of this constitutional monarchy under him. And then, of course, the most famous one was the Revolution of 1917, where eventually he's overthrown his whole dynasty. And then, of course, that at the same time, you had World War I going on, and Russia suffered a lot of defeats in World War I. And so it helped to kind of spark a lot of revolutions in the country. There was a lot of unrest because a lot of the lower classes didn't really have any rights under him. Mostly just had like a nobility controlling everything with a large peasant class with very little middle class. And later, the Bolsheviks seized power. Communists in the country. And eventually they captured Nicholas II and they had him killed. His whole family, if you know about, was executed by them in 1918. And Russia from there would then form the Soviet Union, the USSR, which I think was in power in Russia from pretty much 1922 to 1991 up to like the time of the Cold War era overall. So Russia goes through a lot of turbulent period, especially in the 20th century. You'll see the fact that the Russians, a lot of people get killed, like in World War One. They got the Russian Civil War. You got all the Stalinist purges we'll get to later, where Joseph Stalin takes over the the Soviet Union. And then you got World War II on top of that. So, yeah, the 19th century was kind of a period where Russia, I think they stayed too conservative, is what happened. And eventually, early 20th century with the loss of World War I and all that, it eventually led to the Russian Revolution, 1917. But I'll get to that later when I get more into World War I. I'll talk, more into kind of what happens with the Russians and all that. Now, later in the week, on Wednesday, I'll get into talking about like mostly industrialization, how by the 1800s, a lot of European countries start to industrialize. That's something that happens like in Britain, France, Germany, and other countries, even spreads worldwide, United States, even into Asia as well. I'll also talk about the rise of socialism because the 19th century is a kind of a century of isms. They have all these different movements that happen. I'll probably eventually get to nationalism. We'll also get to imperialism as well, probably by the time we get to World War I, et cetera. But before I go, a reminder about assignments that are out there. I think the exploration quiz is pretty much, I think that's tonight, I believe it closes, I know. And then you've got these other assignments that are out there right now. Conquest of America quiz, of course, needs to be kind of wrapped up too. First exam, and of course, the first exam bonus quiz. Those are all assignments that are pretty much out there right now. I have, like I said, posted a new assignment today, which is a Canvas quiz on the rise of the British Empire lecture. So that's been posted in quizzes pretty much today. Earlier, it looks like I missed Trey. Hey, what's going on? Hope you're having a good afternoon. So anyway, yeah, I'll see y'all pretty much later in the week, like when a part 2 lecture coming up. But like you said, if you have any comments, questions later about this lecture, let me know. Or you can also email me if you got a question, of course, about the class. So y'all take care and have a great rest of the of the week, pretty much. So y'all take care. By the way, happy Valentine's Day out there also as well.